Welcome back to Let Them Eat Bread, everybody. We enjoyed our week off. Hopefully you did too. This week we are back making a French-style loaf. Now, this is not your traditional baguette, but it's going to be somewhat similar. And because it's not exactly a baguette, I don't feel too worried about not doing it the exact way a baguette should be made. And to that effect, I do not have the appropriate tooling with me. However, in order to make our loaves more like a baguette, I'm going to try two different methods of making it kind of into that beautiful long shape that we've all come to appreciate, all right? The first one is going to involve a rolling pin, and the second one is just going to be roughly shaping it, all right? This recipe is actually fairly fast compared to many recipes we make on this show. It only rises one time. So this whole recipe done in less than 2.5 hours, okay? Which is lightning fast when you're making bread. The other thing that makes this particular recipe interesting is that it goes into a cold oven. So we're going to talk about that later in the show. And our bread rises a little longer. So we're going to have an extra long politics segment today, but it does mean that your bread will be ready for you faster than ever. All right, let's get started.
All right, guys, first up, we are going to get ourselves a large mixing bowl, and into that bowl is going to go 2 cups of hot water. We're talking at least 100 degrees Fahrenheit, not over 115. Next up is 1 tablespoon of white or granulated sugar. To that, we are going to add 1.5 packages of active dry yeast, or 3 3/8 teaspoon. All right, very complicated. Just make sure you get it right. You need a lot of yeast for this. Then we're going to give those a mixy mix, and once we do that, we are going to let those sit for about 5 minutes. Make sure it's thoroughly combined. You are not going to dissolve the yeast, but you will dissolve the sugar, and you just want to make sure that's fully combined so the yeast can bloom. All right, I'm telling you 5 minutes, and I'm walking off camera, and I'm walking back on camera, theoretically 5 minutes later. And ta-da! Look how beautiful our yeast is blooming. You can't see that, of course, because I've kind of hidden the ball on this one. My apologies. Next up, we have our flour. We're going to be using 5 to 6 cups of hard wheat flour. I found, and we're adding one flour at a time. We're adding one bit at a time. Then our tablespoon of salt. Guys, for this one, I used probably closer to 6 cups of flour. You definitely want to use less than 5. A hard wheat flour requires a lot more liquid, and I did not realize when I was making it. So just keep adding one at a time, mix to combine, make sure it's mostly or completely mixed in before you add the next one. Because if you don't, it's going to be much harder to add them as you go. Again, this recipe actually needs more liquid, so that dumping of the end, doing them, not a good idea. It took me forever to stir, and it will become very difficult to stir. You can see here, I'm just getting off all of the bits of flour that were stuck to my spoon before I poured this out. And then kneading this, if you used the amount of flour that I put in the recipe, is going to be very difficult. So it says to knead for 10 minutes. I ended up kneading it for over 20 minutes, and I've literally sped this camera speed up over 20 times because it just was so difficult to knead. It does not come out that kind of soft, tacky that we're used to when we're kneading something like this because of the hard flour. So your options here are either to reduce the amount of flour you use so that you get a kind of your normal stickier, tackier dough, because it's not going to pass the window pane test. It really doesn't function like that, unfortunately. So what you're going to need to do is keep kneading this. Actually, if you can use a bread machine or a standing mixer, you definitely should, because it's just really difficult to do. Next up, we're oiling our bowl with the usual amount of oil. I probably used a little much here, but that's all right. We're just stirring this around and making sure the bowl is adequately oiled. And then, of course, once I'm done doing whatever it is that I'm doing right now, we're going to put the bread in the bowl, give it a quick toss. Now, because mine was so dry, I made sure that every square inch of this was covered in oil. You do not have to do that, okay? Next, we're going to cover this with some plastic wrap just to make sure that we have do not let any moisture out of this bowl, especially since it's so dry. Then cover with our tea towel to rise. We'll set our timer for 1.5 hours to 2 hours, and Live Ben is going to take over in just a sec.
All right, so we have kneaded our bread. We have coated our bowl with oil, and we have set our bread to rise. Our timer is set for 1.5 hours. If you are sticking with us for our politics portion and our special non-segmented segment, then I will see you in just a second once I do a little bit of cleanup. If you are not staying for the politics portion, then I will see you in about 1 hour and 30 minutes, and we will catch up to shape our loaves in the 2 ways that I mentioned we were going to do earlier, and then we're going to throw them right in the oven, okay? So stick around. if you want to. If not, I'll see you in an hour and a half, and I'll be right back. All right, so we are going to get started with our politics portion. Our first segment, which is not going to make it to an individual clip on YouTube this week, is a bit of an old story. So a bunch of weeks ago, I think it's 4 weeks ago now, Amnesty International, that you know them, you've heard of them. Their symbols, the little eye with the barbed wire, the little candle with the barbed wire around it, looks super sad. They do really great work about calling out war crimes, humanitarian crises, tracking, refugees and things like that. Great organization, do lots of great work. Okay, so recently they published a report on Israel. And this made a lot of waves for a number of reasons. The first of which is Amnesty International used what I will call the A word when describing Israel. They called it an apartheid state. So before we kind of dig into whether that's true or not, and spoiler it is, we kind of need to think about a lot of things. The first of which is, what is apartheid, right? So apartheid is a system of legalized separation enforced by force by one state having to do with one people versus another, right? So when we talk about apartheid, usually we're talking about South Africa, right? And that's the sample that people draw to mind. The segregated South, way back in the day, / like 60 years ago, was a bit like that, right? It was segregation enforced by force, separate but equal, that kind of stuff. So, but generally when people say apartheid, it's most notably related to South Africa. Most people think about South Africa when they say apartheid. And the reason is because that's kind of where this term was first used. It wasn't used in the US. Our segregation was just called segregation. Apartheid was a total and complete separation of the races, with the minority race, as it were, or the under privileged race, as it were, being actively dispossessed of their land, fortunes, rights, and things by the ruling race. And this was specifically a rule by race, right? There was nothing else really to it other than the rule by race situation that we had, that was in South Africa, right? So, and now, it's interesting because in South Africa, specifically the minority whites were ruling over the majority blacks in this way. However, apartheid does not require that a majority rules over a minority or vice versa, right? Apartheid is simply a system in which the state creates separate classes of citizens based on race and rules that way and creates separate systems for them, right? So there were black schools, there were white schools, there were white neighborhoods, there were black neighborhoods. Anything you can imagine that would be segregated like that was. And that system was essentially used, it was the primary way of ruling an entire country for many years in South Africa. Now, of course, South Africa eventually got rid of apartheid. It was a fierce struggle. Nelson Mandela, of course, everyone knows, led that and then became the first black president of South Africa, right? So the question is, if we're going to use apartheid, we have to ask ourselves, in the Israeli context, we have to ask ourselves, is that what is going on in Israel? Now, of course, when we talk about apartheid state in Israel, what we are primarily talking about is Israelis who are just defined as non-Arab people who live in what is now the states of Israel and Palestine. What is now the state of Israel and occupied Palestine. And the Arabs who also live there, right? So, or Arab Israelis, sometimes called Palestinians, sometimes Arab Israelis. If you ask them on the ground, and I've been to Israel several times and I've lived there, so I can tell you for sure, there are people who will consider themselves Arab Israelis who are distinctly not Palestinian, and vice versa. So the terms are less important. Essentially, is there a group of people, Israelis, this includes some Christians too, it's not just Jews, versus Arabs, right? And primarily, by the way, the main delineation, other than the way they look, because many Israelis and Arabs actually look very similar, is primary language of speech, which is Hebrew versus Arabic, right? Now, lots of Palestinians and Arabs grow up speaking Hebrew because they live in Israel, and many Israeli Jews grow up speaking some level of Arabic because they have a lot of people who they interact with who are Arabs or who speak Arabic, right? And you're in the Middle East, lots of people speak Arabic there, right? So, but we're talking about primary language, okay? So we have two distinct groups, I guess is the point I'm trying to make here. So the question is, does one group rule over and lord over another? And the answer here is obviously yes. Now, there are many factors to consider when making this evaluation. And Amnesty does this, and the report is 3,000 pages long, so I have not read all of it. But having lived there and having read the summary of the report, I can tell you that there is one group that lords over the other. Now, this is done in a number of ways. One, there's the literal occupation of the two Palestinian territories, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. There is the occupation of the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria in a war I think it was a 7-day war. So there is an occupation going on, right? There's a literal military occupation going on, and an occupation obviously is lording over individuals, right? No questions asked. So, but does that count for Arabs living in Israel? And the answer is still yes. So there is a legalized racism in Israel where those who are Arabs oftentimes do not have the same de facto rights as Israeli Jews. So they have the same de jure rights, which is to say, on paper they have the same rights, but they were treated in such a way that is not the case. In some ways, a bit like segregation, but not in Israel. It's not necessarily as enforced by law as it is specifically in the Palestinian territories. Okay, but there is a very obvious separation between the Israeli Jews and the Israeli Arabs or the Palestinians, namely of which there's a giant wall on both sides. There is a wall blocking off the Gaza Strip from the Negev Desert and Israel in the south, and there is a wall to the east separating the West Bank, as in the West Bank of the Jordan River, from the rest of Israel and Jerusalem. So there are literal obstacles, but as well as there being literal obstacles, there are physical obstacles too, and a revocation of rights, just like we saw in South Africa. Oftentimes, the property rights of Palestinians and Arab Israelis are not held to as high a standard in Israeli courts. They're not protected as much as privacy rights might be respected for Israeli Jews in Israel, and so on and so forth, right? So it's important when making a decision about whether there is some level of kind of lord overship of one race for another to kind of look at these nuances, right? And to, see what level of representation is there in government, what levels of individual rights are there. So property rights is usually the biggest individual right that people tend to talk about. Also, freedom of autonomy, freedom of body, freedom of movement, freedom of speech. Now, many Palestinians who speak out against the terrible conditions that they are in find themselves either in Israeli custody, being harassed by Israelis, or unfortunately have ended up dead. Now, recently, and by the way, part of the reason this whole report is coming out now-ish is because a neighborhood in East Jerusalem called Sheikh Jarrah is essentially being uprooted by Israeli settlers being uprooted by Israeli settlers to get rid of the Palestinians and to claim kind of more land for Israel, right? And there's an active program of the Israeli government to encourage these settlers, these settler colonialists, to push out Palestinians to make way for more Israeli settlements. And essentially what this is doing is using an approach with which you can claim that your people live there, therefore you should have the land, right? So in some ways, strangely enough, this is very similar to what Putin is continuing to do with the Donbass in Ukraine, right? Saying, hey, there are ethnic Russians there, they want to be part of Russia, therefore we should have that land, right? And so Israel's kind of doing the same thing, but instead of there actually being Jewish Israelis there for them to liberate, as it were, or to incorporate into Israel. They're actually moving people there and then claiming the land on top of it, right? So we have a distinctive racial program enforced by the government, and we have the rights of individual Palestinians being taken away, namely in the form of property rights and bodily autonomy. There are often attacks on Arabs and Muslims, especially when it concerns they're going to the religious holidays. You have definitely seen on the news that the Temple Mount, I'm forgetting the name of the building there. My apologies, just slipped my mind. I've been there. Dome of the Rock. Thank you. So the Dome of the Rock is a place where Arabs and Muslims pray. Not all Muslims are Arab, obviously. Not all. Well, actually, that's true too. Not all Muslims are Arabs. Not all Arabs are Muslim. My apologies for using the term semi-interchangeably. They are distinct groups. So Muslims go and pray there, but oftentimes there have been attacks by Israeli soldiers when there are large crowds of Muslims in that area. They see the presence of large groups of Muslims as a provocation, much like in South Africa and actually even in the United States, where large groups of blacks were considered a provocation to white authorities. So, right, so more along the lines of what apartheid looks like. So what I'm trying to say here is the calling it apartheid is actually not at all surprising. The timing of which is also not surprising in the sense that the Sheikh Jarrah evictions were just so blatantly racist that it became difficult to ignore the problem any longer. Truthfully, Israel, unfortunately, from a governmental level, and this says nothing of individual Israelis necessarily, is a racist state and has been for a very long time. It has been a consistent project to push Palestinians and Arabs out and to create room for Israelis, namely Jews, right? Of course, there are Muslim Israelis who feel particular fealty to the Israeli state. There are Christian Israelis. There are Israelis of all kinds, secular Israelis, what have you, okay? So this is not to speak of individual Israelis. This has to talk about a program of the government which actively lords over, removes the rights of, and disenfranchises Palestinians and Arabs, right? So now that we can hopefully now we can agree that the report of Amnesty International is valid, okay? Really, this report probably should have come out 30, 40 years ago, but well, I don't really know why it hasn't, because these types of behaviors have been going on for a long time. And I haven't lived in Israel for 6 or 7 years, and I can tell you when I was there, and even the first times I was there, you could see that there was a dichotomy between Arabs and Israelis and Palestinians and Jews. So it's just it's overdue. Let me just put it that way. Okay. So moving on from that, and look, I think it's very difficult to agree with this assessment when you look at the analogs with South Africa and you look at the way that the Israeli government has treated Arabs and Palestinians. But if you disagree, I don't really know what to tell you. That the proof is all there. But so the other reason that this announcement kind of made a big stink was because immediately lots of people who have trusted Amnesty International and their work for years and years and years have turned around and called Amnesty International an anti-Semitic organization. Now, I want to take a second here to address the claims of anti-Semitism, because it's actually, to call this report anti-Semitic is actually very hurtful to any efforts against anti-Semitism in general. Okay, so the reason that is because, first and foremost, this is not anti-Semitism. Okay, but if you call things like this anti-Semitism, then you dull the power, as it were, of calling things anti-Semitism, because there is still a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. I'm living in America and I'm seeing it. It's getting worse here. It's getting worse around the world. But that is actually attacks against Jews because of their Jewry, because they are Jewish, which is an immutable characteristic, whether it's our ethnicity or our religion. Okay? That is what anti-Semitism is. It is the hatred of Jews for their ethnic Jewness. Now, we have migrated that to be anti-Judaism as well, and that I think is acceptable because it kind of goes deep into that, that original hatred. And by the way, Jews were a people before they were a religion. So we were the Hebrews before we were Jews, as it were, right? And Hebrews comes from the language that we spoke. Jews, Judahites, comes from the land of Judah that we occupied. We were a people first, okay? So we were an ethnicity first before we were religion. So saying that anti-Judaism is similar to anti-Semitism is fine, perfectly normal. What isn't fine is saying that criticism of a sovereign nation's governmental structures is anti-Semitic, because the criticism of the Israeli government doesn't come from a place of, is not often coming from a place of, I hate Jews, therefore the Israeli government is bad. And if you stop to listen to the specific criticisms that people have of the Israeli government, you will see that they don't say, we hate the Israeli government because they are Jews. We hate the Israeli government because they enact systems of oppression which force out people who have lived there for a very long time, right? And those two things, those things are not related, right? Being Jewish and being in Israeli government are not related. It may be the case that the vast majority of people in the Israeli government are Jews, but also the vast majority of the population of Israel are Jews. So that's where that correlation is coming from. It has nothing to criticism of the government doesn't make you an anti-Semite. Just like criticizing the government of Saudi Arabia, which I have done on this show and continue to do, does not make you an Islamophobe. I don't hate the Saudi government because they are Muslims. I hate the Saudi government because they're a vicious regime which beheads people in the public square, doesn't let women drive, actively fuels jihadism around the world for their own benefit, is bombing and causing a genocide in Yemen, is using price manipulation and price fixing to manipulate the oil economy to make my prices more expensive at the gas pump, right? They start wars in the Middle East. They start proxy wars in the Middle East. That's why I hate the Saudi kingdom's government. It has nothing to do with the fact that they're Muslim. And the fact that I bring that up, these criticisms of the Saudi government, does not make me anti-Muslim. And if I were to go and criticize the Vatican and the way that they have handled the sex scandal, the priest sex scandal, that wouldn't make me anti-Christian. It would simply be looking at an institution, evaluating the way that it has exercised its governmental authority, and said that they didn't do so well in that authority. They did not use that authority responsibly. So it's very important to me that when we talk about the Israeli government and we talk about things that are said about the Israeli government, we remember that we're talking about an institution, okay? And while it's true that institutions are made up of people, it is not always the case that all of the people in the institution feel the way that the institution acts, right? There are minority parties in Israel. There are Arab parties in Israel. Now, some of those Arab parties, go along with what's going on, and some of them protest it. There are reserved Arab seats, so there will always be Arabs in the Israeli government. But making those criticisms doesn't make you anti-Jewish. It doesn't make you anti-Jews as an ethnicity. It makes you against the actions of a government, just like criticizing any other government. And because it is an institution, regardless of who you are, you should feel comfortable criticizing that institution when they do things that you don't approve of, right? And for me, I can criticize the Israeli government, not because I'm Jewish, but because I'm a person who disagrees with what that government has done. Just like I can criticize any government, even ones that are based on theocratic or religious rule, and not be against that religion. I can be against Iran, but not an Islamophobe. I can criticize theocracy and not be against the religion with which the theocracy is aligned, okay? So it's so important that we have these conversations and that we call out governments for doing things that are bad. So I actually applaud Amnesty International for releasing this report. My only criticism is that they should have released it before I was born, right? These issues in Israel with Arabs and Palestinians have been going on for decades and decades and decades, long before I was born, and they will likely continue. And if the international community, through vehicles like Amnesty International, the United Nations, and things like that, don't hold Israel accountable for the crimes against humanity it is committing, then we create a situation where we say to Israel, it's okay for you to do what you're doing. And more importantly than that, not only is it okay for you to do what you're doing, we're going to fly cover for you by saying that anyone who criticizes you as an institution is anti-Semitic. And that can't fly. Because if you do that, you're going to create cover for any other theocratic or religiously aligned regime. Saudi Arabia, Iran, India under the BJP. So we have to be careful about how we use anti-Semitism. There is anti-Semitism in the world, and it's dangerous, and it hurts people, and it hurts me. But criticizing the Israeli government doesn't hurt me. It doesn't make it any more likely that an anti-Semitic attack happens to me if you criticize the Israeli government. And that's the point I'm trying to make. You do not put Jews in danger by criticizing the government of Israel. You put Jews in danger by equating attacks on the government of Israel to attacks on Jewry, because then attacks on Jewry become things that people are not so concerned about because you are crying wolf with anti-Semitism. And in order for anti-Semitism to continue to have the punch that it has had since World War II, we must be extremely careful with how we use the word anti-Semitism, with how we invoke anti-Semitism, with how we invoke the memories of anti-Semitism that are all too fresh in the minds and understandings of Jewish people around the world. Last thing on this. One of the reasons I'm pressing so hard on this is because anti-Semitism is truly dangerous, and it doesn't just have short-term effects. Did you know that the Jewish population in the world has still not recovered from the Holocaust, which was over 70 years ago? If anti-Semitism is allowed to come back, and it is confused with things, and it becomes a cry wolf thing, and people stop responding to it in the visceral way that they should, we can get situations where we start to forget, and never again doesn't mean anything. And we get to a situation where even though we haven't recovered from the last major anti-Semitic crisis, the Holocaust, we could have another one. And I know that sounds hyperbolic. I get it. I really do. And I'm not saying that a Holocaust is imminent, okay? I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, in order for Jews to continue to reap the benefits, whatever they are, however small they are, of the visceral reaction that is given to the word anti-Semitism, that people shy away from it, whatever benefit that conveys to us, we water that down. We dilute the effect of that by saying things like criticism of the Israeli government, criticisms of Israeli politicians, criticisms of money in politics are anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is real. It's a very distinct and discrete thing, and we should call it out when it's there. But when it's not there, we should shut up about it. Okay. All right, so we have a little bit of positive news, maybe. Woo! So Ron Klain, who is Joe Biden's chief of staff, did an interview on one of the shows, and he was talking about student loan debt. And specifically, he was talking about, hey, look, isn't it cool? He didn't say it, is it cool? I'm paraphrasing. Isn't it cool that no one has actually paid any student loans under our administration? And he talked about how they were going to make a decision about extending the pause or canceling some level of student debt before the student loans are set to start repayment, which, by the way, is May 1st. Okay, so mark your calendars, May 1st. Before then, we are going to hear some level of something from the White House concerning student loan debt. Now, does it mean cancellation? Maybe. Probably not whole cancellation, right? Don't get your hopes up, because there is $1.4 trillion of federally held student debt, right? It's a lot of money. Probably not going to cancel all of it. But Biden could cancel some of it. And truthfully, even if Biden didn't cancel all of it, there is some political incentive for him to cancel at least some of it. And the reason is, right now, his approval rating, not so good. Democrats' approval rating, not so good. They need something to get people to go to the polls to be like, hey, the Democrats actually did something for me. Not like one time, but like twice. So in order for them to get that, this is an extremely easy win, right? Build Back Better is dead. Any other, stimulus checks, care packages, anything you might expect from the federal government is totally out of here, right? Manchin and Sinema are actively destroying any good thing the Democrats even might pretend to want to do. Okay, so just put that all out of your mind. Nothing good is happening while Biden is president. Just letting you know. Okay, just start coming with that expectation, and you'll be real great. But Biden kind of knows this, and by sending his chief of staff out into the world and saying, "Hey, student loan debt cancellation, then it starts, part of this is testing the waters, right? So politicians will kind of say things and see what the reaction is, or they'll put something out into the world. Maybe not they say it, like the representative says it, but they'll put information out into the world, just see if people react. And oftentimes that reaction will guide their next move, whether they actually do the thing or they don't do the thing, or they do, some level of the thing, whatever it's going to be, right? There is some understanding kind of in the political world that when you put out a little feeler like this, you're looking to see what the reaction is. So the best way, actually, for us to secure some level of student debt relief is actually to just essentially have conversations like, hey, Joe Biden, wouldn't it be nice if you canceled some student debt? We're drowning in it. So, there are lots of organizations, SDCC, I think is what it's called, and other organizations out there who are constantly sending petitions to the White House, sending form letters that you just add your name to that you can share on your social media. I've shared on my personal social media as well. But there are ways to actually try and communicate with the White House, because once this feeler is out there, they're looking for a reaction, okay? And that reaction is going to come from a couple of places. It's going to come from fellow lawmakers and administrative staff around the White House. So it's going to come from that kind of Washington, D.C. bubble. It's going to come from the media, right? What is Fox News saying? What is CNN saying? What is MSNBC saying, right? But it's also going to come from regular people, right? Who's contacting the White House? Are there letters? Are there petitions? Like, what is going through the mind of people? And some of this to figure that. And by the way, they'll run polling on this too, possibly, to see, hey, like, would you be more likely to vote for a Democrat if, some debt was canceled? So when a feeler like this is put out, and this is for any issue, I'm just explaining for student debt because that's what we're talking about. We, now that we're kind of being reached out to, just need to come forward and say that we want it done, right? Hey, Biden, it'd be great if you did this, right? So anything that you can do, look for petitions online if you feel so inclined. Have conversations with your neighbors, take interviews if that's a thing that you have the ability to do. I don't. And just talk about this issue, right? And make sure that some level of the people's voice is getting back to the White House, because that's what they're inviting right now. Even though they haven't said it, this is the gig, right? So if we convey to the White House, hey, wouldn't it be cool if you canceled student debt or conveyed to us some level of student debt relief? That'd be pretty rad, and maybe we'd even vote for you. Those types of messages are more likely make it more likely that Biden will follow through with some of this. Now, mind you, these messages may never get to him, and he may make a decision even without it, even if the messages do get to him, right? It's hard to say. Biden is a conservative by his very nature. He always has been. He always will be. But he needs something, and the Democrats need something because the midterms are coming, and they don't look good. So this is a very easy issue for them to kind of placate people on. He doesn't need Congress to do it, even though he pretends he does. And, it would actually seriously improve the lives of lots of people. So, do what you can. Make it known that student debt relief is something that we're inherently interested in. And with any luck, by May 1st, we'll have some kind of relief. We'll see what's up. I want to keep on this, not just because I have student loans myself, because I'm genuinely interested to see what happens. And if there is some level of resolution on this, I promise I'll bring it back on the show and I'll let you guys know how it went. All right? How are we doing? 8 minutes. Look. Yeah, it smells so fishy. So the war in Ukraine is continuing. We are in week 2 of the Russia invasion of Ukraine. There has been pitch resistance by the Ukrainians. There has been all sorts of war crimes. And I don't want you to think that the reason there are so many war crimes is because either side is inherently evil. Although you may believe that, although I talked last week on the show about why you shouldn't do that, right? Why you shouldn't create heroes and villains in war. But the truth is, the reason there are war crimes in war is because there's war, right? War is a nasty thing. And we live in an age where, as much as we have technology, we have more of an ability to blow up lots of things than to blow up targeted things. So, is it possible that war crimes are being committed intentionally? Yeah, of course. It's very possible that's the case. And look, regardless of the war crime being committed on purpose, by accident, oopsie daisy, whatever, they're all bad, and I condemn all of them. However, what we need to understand as people looking into a war is that as long as the war goes on, there are going to be war crimes always. You are never just going to kill combatants. You are never just going to bomb military installations. You are never just going to kill people who have volunteered to be killed in war, right? Soldiers, leaders, what have you. We are continually living in urbanized societies. Military bases are near hospitals, near residential areas, near homes. Government buildings are near office buildings, right? There are very small spaces between things that are legitimate war targets and things that are civilian targets. And by the way, this is made more complicated by the fact that a lot of warfare takes place in cities, right? We aren't in the days of Napoleonic Europe when people are fighting out in lines on a field somewhere away from town, right? Battles are taking place in cities. They're taking place around where people live or lived if they've evacuated. And so because of this, you will have stray bullets, you'll have stray explosions, you'll have a mortar that is at the wrong angle, you'll have all sorts of things. And because the technology is so powerful, the explosives are so powerful, even with the greatest amount of technology possible, boom is still boom, and you are essentially going to get destruction of all kinds, right? And by the way, even if you are very careful and precise with the way you destroy things, there are still after effects, right? So if a bomb goes off somewhere, right, there's a shockwave from that bomb. It could send out windows, which could cut, the glass could break and hurt someone or whatever. You could, you could hit a tank on a highway, but then that tank could fall. You could destroy the road, or you could destroy, um, a service line or a water line, something that is needed to keep people alive. And because technically that's civilian infrastructure, that's a war crime, right? But war crimes are inherent to the nature of modern war by its nature, is the point I'm trying to make. And therefore, if we are going to have war, we are going to have war crimes, which means that the only solution to war crimes is just to not have war at all. Now, easier said than done. I get that. But when we start pointing fingers all over the place and making good guys and bad guys and saying, oh, they're committing war crimes, oh, they're committing war crimes, oh, they're committing war crimes, we use the accusation of war crimes to justify the actions and reactions of people on the ground in war. And by the way, war crimes are more likely to be committed as sides become increasingly desperate, right? So, and look, this can happen on both sides, right? So the Ukrainians can get desperate because Russian troops are closing in. The Russians could get desperate because maybe a plan went wrong that wasn't supposed to, and they start shelling indiscriminately. The point is, there isn't, like, you don't make one side better than the other by tallying up the war crimes of one side versus the other. Because the amount of war crimes that are going to get committed in this war, just like in all modern wars, are going to be uncomfortable, to say the least. And lots of people who shouldn't die are going to die. Whether they die in Ukraine or in Russia or, in maternity wards or on the streets. The nature of modern war invites war crimes. And one side is not better than the other because it commits fewer war crimes. It just isn't. So if you're going to have a side, and I don't think people should have a side, obviously, if you do have a side, you need to be careful about not erasing the faults of the side that you are on, right? So if you support the Russians for whatever reason, you need to acknowledge that maternity wards and hospitals and civilian infrastructure and bridges are getting bombed, and that and that civilians are being bombed. If you support the Ukrainians, you have to recognize the existence of the Azov battalion, and you have to recognize the existence of reports that Russian artillerymen are not being captured alive anymore, that Russians who surrender are being killed, that Russians in prisoners of war camps are not being treated well. There are reports out there of those as well, right? So whatever side you want to take, and by the way, I do not advocate having a side. I think having a side in something like this is pointless unless your side is peace, and you will do anything to get to peace. But if you do insist on taking some kind of side, you do not get to claim that your other side is worse because more war crimes. Okay, you can claim that the other side is worse for other reasons, but that one, it just rings hollow because the way that wars are conducted now, there's no way to get around war crimes. There will never be a conventional war like we're seeing now that is not riddled with war crimes. It's literally impossible with the way wars are fought nowadays. And by the way, this is not to say that war crimes didn't happen in the past. They did. And they probably happened at equally or slightly lesser levels of discomfort to people looking back at them. And lots of civilians died in wars in the past. I'm not saying they didn't. But what I'm trying to say, and I guess the point of this segment, is twofold. And I'll close with this because I think I've made my points. If there's going to be a war, there are going to be war crimes. And two, the only way to avoid war crimes are peace, is peace. Sorry, it's the same one. 3/2.5. Neither side of this conflict is better than the other because fewer war crimes committed. I know it's an unpopular opinion, and I'm sure I will get ratioed for this take. But it's difficult for me to see how one side is better than the other when both sides are committing war crimes. One civilian dead is one too many, regardless of who kills them and regardless of why. So while we're on the topic of war, I wanted to talk about war in general. And I know I kind of did that a little bit in the last segment, but specifically, I want to talk about war and peace. And no, I'm not going to not the book, and I'm not going to talk about, the book or its author. But war only begets more war. There is no fighting for peace. There is fighting for peace, but you're not going to fight for peace by actively fighting like in a war. It's just not going to happen. That level of combat does not beget peace. Peace and deliberation and diplomacy beget peace. They don't. War begets war. And oftentimes, the resolution to war can beget war. And the reason for that is because oftentimes, when a war ends, there is not a reconciliation. There's a punishment, right? Hey, we beat you, therefore you need to do this for us, right? And part of the reason that this revenge takes place is because war is costly in terms of blood and treasure. And it is very rare that two sides of a war are able to say, you know what, we had fun while it lasted, but we're going to go our separate ways, and there doesn't need to be any resolution that involves more complications or wars. And we can see this with the US war in Afghanistan, where, it kind of looked like, hey, we were going to play nice. We were going to say, hey, you know what? We lost. We're leaving. No big deal. Don't worry about it. Just let us go, and then we'll be, we'll be chill, right? It'll be all good. Be like, we never went in. You can do what you want. We'll do what we want. It'll be great. And so it did look like, in that sense, we were going to have a peaceful resolution to that conflict and the occupation. But it wasn't going to be, because the United States then turned around and froze a bunch of the Afghan government's money and put crippling sanctions back on them, to the point now that more people are dying from starvation than died in the 20 years of occupation. And the reason that we did that was because we were butthurt about losing. There was no good reason for us to do that. And I talked on the show many weeks ago about, we gave up. We acknowledged that the Taliban was going to be in charge of Afghanistan, and we were cool with that until we left, and then we decided we weren't cool with that. Famously, the end of World War II imposed the Treaty of Versailles on Germany, the Weimar Republic, and made life there absolutely miserable, utterly destroyed Germany as a country, and revoked their right to self-defense and other rights that they had as a country before the war. And that level of revenge allowed for any strong man, but specifically Hitler, to rise to power and to scapegoat his way into the German chancellery, and through, and he fed off public sentiment that, and he argued, look, our situation's unfair, and truthfully, it was. Germany had lost the war, it's true, but just because they lost the war doesn't necessarily mean that it is appropriate for them to be put in such a terrible position that they cannot recover from the war. Because if a country is put in that position, they're simply going to lash out, just as we saw that Germany did, right? And there are other examples through history. That one just kind of, those two just kind of stick out as being prominent examples. But in order for us to get to a place where we can have perpetual peace, we need to we need to beget peace, right? We need to put peace into the world. We have to come at our diplomacy. We have to come at our negotiations. We have to come with our international relations and our compromises from a place of peace is the only option, right? If we come at any discussion or negotiation or diplomatic whatever with, hey, if we don't like what you're doing, we can always pursue war, then we will never have true peace, right? War begets war. It always has, it always will. And peace begets peace. But that doesn't mean like peace from fighting. You actually have to bring the idea of peace. And peace doesn't just mean, no war, but it also means harmonious living, right? You don't have to like every country on earth as a nation. You don't even have to participate with every country on earth, right? It's like if you're at a high school or a college reunion or whatever, or just any type of reunion, you don't have to be friends with everyone there. But what's important is that you showed up to the reunion, right? You can talk to the people you do like and then leave. But it doesn't make sense for you to come to the reunion and then punch the guy who bullied you 10 years ago. He probably doesn't remember, or she doesn't probably remember why they bullied you in the first place, right? But but coming to that place with peace means you have to do it actively. You have to create peace wherever you go. You can't use war to justify whatever it is you do, or to create justifications for war. I talked a couple of weeks ago about that there are no justifiable wars. And I still stand by that. I believe very strongly that there are no justifiable wars. And if you have that belief, you need to advocate for peace in everything. Peace in the way nations treat each other, peace in the way people treat each other, peace in the way that economies treat each other, that we interact in the global economic stage. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this is because right now, Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine is doing a world tour asking for people to, well, he's asking specifically for a no-fly zone, but he's also asking for MiG fighter jets to be given to Ukrainian pilots. Now, by asking other nations to participate in this war, he's only perpetuating more war. Now, it's true, they are the most victimized of all the actors in this war. I get that. But it simply begets more war. And this is especially true in this case, where the nations that are being asked to participate would essentially, if they were to get in conflict with Russia, would spark some kind of World War III or nuclear apocalypse. And we can't have that, right? And what's interesting is that this consideration is either not being considered by President Zelensky, or he doesn't, or he downplays the risks of what could be. because he's asking for two things, which I think the two things he's asking for, I think, are problematic for discrete reasons. So the first thing he's asking for is a no-fly zone, which, by the way, is not some magic EMP, electromagnetic pulse, or shield or whatever that you can put in Ukraine and say, oh, well, no one's allowed to fly here now. That's not how that works. A no-fly zone, as I mentioned on the show last 2 weeks ago, is enforced by real people. They come from a country. They're trained in the military. They have an allegiance. And when one of those pilots shoots down a Russian whatever, that's an act of war by whatever country that pilot's coming from. And that, of course, brings us to kind of a World War III scenario, which we don't want. And the second thing that he's asking for are fighter jets, MiG fighter jets for Ukrainian pilots. Now, what's interesting about this request is that, according to the reports that I've seen, there are no air bases in Ukraine that could launch these jets, even if they were to be delivered. So what that means is that Ukrainian pilots would have to go to another country to take off from. Now, Russia has said that if that happens, they will take it as an act of war from the country who let the Ukrainians take off from there, which makes sense, by the way. I mean, if you're offering your military hardware, if you're offering your military hardware to another country, you are in some ways aligning yourself to them. And it's not like, just giving them the jets. You would actually have to allow them to leave your ground and come and refuel using your fuel and store their planes in your hangars. I mean, it's more involved, right? And so the Russians would see that, I think rightly, as a declaration of war by whatever country was going to let them do it, whether it was the US or Poland. By the way, both of which NATO nations, World War III, end of the world. We don't want to do that. So, as much as it is incredibly painful to watch what's going on in Ukraine, we cannot allow ourselves to be deceived into thinking that more war, more violence, more military pressure on the Russians will cause peace. War only begets war. War does not beget peace. Peace does not beget war. We have to use non-violent means to the extent possible to dissuade Russia. Because if we do what's being asked, we're going to have a war that is more violent, more painful, more deadly than anything any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And we can't have that. So I want to talk about sanctions. So this segment's going to be a little different than when I spoke about sanctions coming off of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, because I want to talk specifically about the sanctions that are being imposed on Russia by the rest of the world. Now, let's start with the obvious question. Do I support sanctions? Yes, but those sanctions need to be targeted specifically to the people who are causing the hurt. Okay? So, in my mind, the people who are causing the hurt in Ukraine are the Russian military, the Russian petrol barons and coal barons, and the oligarchs that support them. Okay? 3 groups, people. Okay. Who is not causing the Ukrainians harm? Regular Russian people in Russia, regular Russian people around the world. And I think that list on both sides is fairly agreeable. I would be surprised if you disagreed with it. So if we want to create pain for the people who are causing pain, then we have to target our sanctions in such a way that we only hurt those people. Which, by the way, is not easy, because oftentimes the systems that the people who are causing pain and the people who are not causing pain use are going to be similar. So an excellent example of something that I think, of a sanction, as it were, that's kind of ridiculous that is being done now, is that Apple Pay and Google Pay have stopped allowing their payment services to operate in Russia. So you might think that this is fairly innocuous, right? There's other ways to pay. However, in the Moscow metro, people can pay by using Google Pay and Apple Pay, right? And that allows people to go through faster. Anyone with, some kind of wireless card that you can use for your mass transit knows that it makes it much easier to just kind of, to tap your device or card or whatever and just get on the bus, train, light rail, whatever, right? It just makes it faster. There's less queuing. There are fewer delays, that kind of thing. So there were significant delays for people trying to use the Moscow subway. Regular people, regular Russians who have nothing to do with this war, are being hurt and inconvenienced by something that's, supposed to make us feel better about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine, right? Same thing with targeting the banks and saying that the banks can't use their foreign reserves to offset the issues with the Russian currency. Now, do I think it's important that we've targeted the Russian currency? Yes, because the war chest is what is being used to harm Ukraine. So in some ways, that makes sense to do. However, on the flip side, by kicking these banks out of SWIFT, which is the Brussels-based international system for allowing financial transactions to go bank to bank, you also stop regular Russians from processing and using those services, right? So sending a check to someone outside of Russia, receiving money in Russia, being able to use, any other type of bank services that are related to the rest of the world, well, you're hurting people who had nothing to do with the conflict, right? So when we're looking at what a sanctions package should entail and what kind of pain we want to inflict on those inflicting pain, there are some obvious ones, right? So you should freeze the individual accounts of these oligarchs and coal barons and petrol barons and Putin. You can freeze their passports, stop them from leaving, seize their assets around the world, whether those are hard assets like boats, yachts, racing cars, mansions, what have you, or whether those are soft assets like Swiss bank accounts and things like that. You can seize those and actually cause active pain to the people who are causing pain without hurting regular Russian people who are just trying to send money or to take the train to work or to buy groceries or to buy gas. For a while, it looked like the Biden administration was actually going to go that route only, that they were going to be very careful and selective about how the U.S. deals with Russia, economically speaking. But that has since changed. Additionally, we are seeing around the world a kind of rise of xenophobia, and I talked about it 2 weeks ago, but it's gotten worse. We have 10 U.S. states now who have declared that Russian vodka cannot be sold in their state. And I hate to break it to you, I really do. Boycotting vodka is not going to stop the war effort. It's just not. By the way, one of the things that I think is very interesting about this is that the more that you create collective punishment systems, the more you're going to drive the Russian people into the arms of Putin. This has happened in lots of different places where we disagree where the U.S. disagrees with the way a government is running, and we try to hurt the people. The people have often rallied around their leaders because they see the people who are hurting them more than their leaders are actually the people imposing the sanctions, the ones making their lives miserable, the ones making their currency worthless. So if we're not careful with our sanctions, not only do we unintentionally hurt people that we don't mean to, or intentionally hurt people who we shouldn't, we also create an incentive and a very easy propaganda campaign for anyone who is trying to create a situation where you encourage the population to actually rally behind the leader, right? Because they see the leader as being the least worst option, right? So obviously, don't boycott Russian products just because they're Russian. Don't boycott Russian restaurants. Don't get mad at individual Russian people. There are plenty of people to be angry at. But regular Russians at home in Russia or abroad in the rest of the world just don't make the cut. And the best way to encourage them to turn on Putin, whether at home or abroad, is to show them that we actually support them in doing that around the world. And you don't do that by actively harming them. You do that by engaging with them and encouraging them to denounce what's going on. Because the more you hurt them, the less incentive they have to do that. They're just not going to want to. Even if they drop out of the whole thing and be neutral, you still haven't gotten the objective you wanted, which is to get them to turn on their leader, to make the war less popular, to make it more likely that the war stops. So as we go forward, we just need to be careful. And by the way, last point. At first, when the war was first declared, only about 50% of Russians even supported the war. That is crazy low numbers for starting a war. That number is only going to get worse if we play our cards right. And the less popular the war is, the more likely it is that it stops, or that Putin gets desperate and does something crazy. But we need to rely on whatever semblance of democracy is left. We need to put pressure on the oligarchs. We need to put pressure on Putin. And we need to encourage regular Russian people to put pressure on Putin. And encourage them to do so, and even reward them for doing so. That is how we're going to end this war, in my opinion. We're not going to do it by hurting regular Russians. So please don't. It doesn't help anyone, but it does hurt someone. 25 minutes. Oh, so long. Are we even growing in here? Oh, yeah. We're cooking with gas. Okay. Hey, man, as long as it's going, it all really matters to me. What do I got left? Oh, that's going to be a fun one. Wow. I don't want to play. Okay, sure. Okay. All right. So, the war in Ukraine is primarily a war based on fossil fuels. So I say that not just because we are seeing that the access to fossil fuels has hampered the world's resistance to Russian invasion of Ukraine. So what I mean by that is the US and the EU and the UK find it difficult to get rid, to sanction Russian oil and gas because the European Union is largely reliant on it. And if the UK or the US were to sanction it, we would essentially be sanctioning our allies for using it. And they have to because they import a ton of it. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, Russia provides roughly 40% of Europe's oil and gas. So, and by the way, since the war has started, I'm sure you've noticed that gas prices have gone up precipitously because of the global supply being restricted and having to get gas from other places. Now, it is true that in many cases, oil and gas companies have raised the prices just because, and they're essentially colluding to keep the prices high. But it is also the case that this is a war of fossil fuels. And the other reason that that's a war of fossil fuels is because there's been some reporting that there are significant deposits of oil and gas under Ukraine that were recently discovered, like in 2014. And this invasion may be an attempt to consolidate those resources under Russian ownership. So, all that being said, we have to remind ourselves that we are still, as a society, largely dependent on fossil fuels. There's very little that we cannot do without them. As of right now, we generate most of our electricity through fossil fuels. We heat our homes primarily through fossil fuels. We fuel our vehicles, whether ground, air, or sea vehicles, primarily by fossil fuels. So pretty much anything that anyone wants to do ever has to do with fossil fuels. It's powered by fossil fuels in some way, shape, or form. So the obvious solution here is to not do that, right? So how do we not do that? So in the U.S. context, we had this Green New Deal, as it was called. We actually didn't pass it, despite what Republicans will tell you. And what it would do, among other things, is limit our reliance on fossil fuels in general. It would put us in a position where instead of relying on fossil fuels to do the things that we needed to do, we might rely on batteries or electricity or solar panels or wind farms or hydroelectric or tidal power or geothermal or any of the other number of ways that we can generate energy without needing to use fossil fuels. And essentially, if we had already been there, we would have removed a significant amount of Putin's leverage that he has on Europe and the world economy in general, because we wouldn't need his gas. And especially because renewable resources are, well, renewable, there's no one who can restrict their supply, right? You can't stop geothermal vents from being hot. They are hot because that's of plate tectonics and how the earth works, right? You can't stop the sun from shining, the wind from blowing, the seas from battering coastlines, the waters from flowing through hydroelectric dams, etc. And if we're going to have wars, and by the way, I'm sorry to say, we only have wars over energy because the energy we have is a finite, limited resource. We would cease to have wars over energy literally overnight if we just had not unlimited energy, because I don't think renewable energy is unlimited energy, but non-finite amounts of energy, right? And by that, I simply mean energy that can be used and reused over and over again, like the sun or the wind or the waves. When Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposed the Green New Deal, the primary question she got was, how are you going to pay for it? And her remark, which I still think about to this day, is how can we not afford it, right? So the question was, how can we afford it? She says, how can we not afford it? And the reason that resonates so well is not just because as the climate changes, we will continue to pay the costs of rebuilding and moving people away from places that are no longer livable and accepting refugees. But we're also going to have, as these resources become more, as these non-renewable resources become more finite and thus more valuable, we're going to see wars over energy. And we'll probably see them around the same time we start seeing wars over water, right? As climate change intensifies, and as fossil fuels become more and more valuable because there are fewer and fewer of them, because we're burning all of them, we're going to get to a situation where we have these conflicts, where we have climate conflicts and energy conflicts. And if we had just, and those are incredibly expensive in both in blood and treasure. Blood obviously being much more valuable than treasure. And if we had just had the foresight to create a world where we were not so dependent on, geopolitical ownership of finite reserves of energy producing resources, we would be, as a world, just in a much better place. I would argue that if we had transitioned to renewable energy, or clean energy, if you want to include nuclear, the war in Ukraine would never have happened. Now, look, the last time I said that about a casus belli, I was wrong, right? I had talked about in the past how, NATO was probably the cause of this war, but it appears that is incorrect. So obviously, take that with a grain of salt, but it is not difficult to see that whether we like it or not, there are going to be wars concerning energy. But we can avoid that if we take the necessary steps to just make sure that energy is low cost or free for everyone. Not necessarily free at the point of service, but free in the sense that we don't have to dig it out of the ground. There aren't huge amounts of resources we have to put into getting that energy. And that energy isn't finite. It's not made over millions of years. The sun shines every day. The wind blows most days. It rains fairly frequently. The tides always go every day. The rivers are always moving. The earth is always producing shift, which causes the heat vents to get hot for geothermal. It's my hope that this travesty in Ukraine, which, by the way, is not the first climate-related conflict, now that it's happening to people who are receiving much more attention in the media, I hope this will spur us as a world, especially in the West, where we produce most of the carbon emissions of the world, will fuel us to make better decisions about our energy choices, will fuel us to move in a direction where one country cannot exert their influence by war and be appeased because of the way that they can provide oil and gas, these finite resources, to the rest of the world. It's going to take time to get there, and we should have started already. But it's my hope that this will be our awakening moment. I'm not confident that it will be, but I want to have hope. So there's my hope. How are we doing on time? 14 minutes. Can I explain antitrust in 14 minutes? Probably. Better be able to. Oh, well. All right. I'll stand back on this. So, the last issue I want to talk about, and, I genuinely don't know if I'll get all the way to the end of our time here, but if not, it's fine, is antitrust. So, what is antitrust? So, antitrust is a legal term having to do with monopoly power. And for those of you who don't know what monopoly power is, think of a situation where you have, think of two situations. So in the first situation, you have many businesses that sell the same or similar goods or services. Now, in a capitalist economy, they should compete against each other, and that should bring the price as low as possible without, causing the businesses in question to lose money, right? So at the very least, so the price of the good should come as far down as possible such that profit can still be made, right? That is essentially what is expected for businesses that compete against each other, right? They drive down the prices because they want more customers. Customers are intrigued by you can increase the demand for a product by lowering its cost or increasing its supply. So in this situation, prices can decrease, right? And prices are typically under pressure to decrease, and typically competition causes prices to decrease. Now, this isn't a perfect kind of bubble capitalist system. We're just going to take it as it is, okay? No nuances or taxes or whatever. Just bear with me. And in situation 2, you have one business and only one business that sells a good or service. And there's no one that competes with them. And essentially, what happens in situation 2 is because there's no pressure on the price to be lowered, and the single business owns the entirety of the supply of the good or service that is provided, they can charge whatever they want. Essentially, they can charge whatever you're willing to pay for it. And so the price of the good or service will continue to increase until the business realizes that they are selling it at such a high price that there is no longer anyone willing to buy it. And at that point, the price of the product will probably hold until it is perceived that they can move the price again, and the cycle continues. But that's because there's no pressure anywhere to stop the price from moving, except for what will people buy. And if the service is important enough, such as food, gas, food, heating, electricity, or shelter, thank you, then, or healthcare, then it's very likely that the price can go up pretty much forever because it is an essential item, so people will pay whatever they can for it, right? So that second scenario, that single business is a trust. That single monopoly business. That's what a monopoly is. It's one business that controls the entire supply. There's no competition. So antitrust is against these monopolistic situations. Now there's a separate thing called oligopolies. Think about it as there are only a couple of businesses that sell a good or service, and instead of competing against each other, they work together to manipulate the price upwards. Okay, that's called oligopolic collusion. Don't worry about that too much. But technically, antitrust law deals with that too. So antitrust is a legal doctrine dealing with monopolies, right? So that's kind of, hopefully I've illustrated that for you. So what it's meant to do at its best is to ensure that in a market, and a market is often defined by the area people reasonably shop in, right? So, within, let's just call it 30 miles, right? How far are you willing to travel to get this service, right? So within whatever the range is determined, that there are enough businesses with more or less equal market shares such that competition between those organizations, between those businesses, causes the price of a good and service to decrease, or at least to stabilize, right? Because the way that capitalism is supposed to work is through competition, right? So you can do a good thing, you make profits, right? Property is owned by a private individual who makes profit off of that, and then rents labor, buys labor for the rent of wages. But if you end up in a situation where there's no competition, then capitalism isn't really working the way it's supposed to. So antitrust is a way to kind of get capitalism to work the way it's supposed to, because naturally, capitalism does this thing where, because there is such a strong profit motive, and we have created a situation where profits need to continually grow, and we have baked this into our legal structure for businesses, for profit businesses. If you don't make, so much profit, if you don't continue to produce more profit, then you're not doing right by your shareholders, and they get rid of you, right? So I'm sure you've seen things like that. So because we've created this incentive of continual growth, well, the best way to grow once you've been successful is to chew up your competition. And that is done by buying them out or closing them down, one of the two, right? So you can outcompete another business by just doing better than they can do, or you can buy them up and then you can eliminate the competition that way, right? These are called anti-competitive practices. But these anti-competitive practices are often incentivized because the more of the market share you own as a company, and by the way, market share is just what percentage of the area that you sell to do you sell your products to. So if you have a 60% market share, it means that 60% of the people who buy products that you buy, the types of products that you sell, buy your product specifically. Okay. So when, in order to maximize profits, you consolidate your market share, and you want your market share to increase as close to 100 as legally possible, because that way you produce the most profits. And then, of course, when you get to monopoly status, you can make even more profits because there's no one to stop you. There's no competitor, right? Okay. So this is very bad for consumers, right? Monopoly practices, because essentially it means that you have no way to vote with your money, as it were, and to say to an organization, hey, the way that you're behaving is not cool, and I'm going to take my money elsewhere where it's cheaper to do that. So antitrust policies are meant to prevent monopolies and to protect consumers from the types of behavior that monopolies typically engage in. So there's two types of monopoly. There is what's called vertical integration, and then there's what's called horizontal integration. Well, actually, there's more than two types of monopolies, but I want to talk about these two types of integrations. Integrations are a type of monopoly, sorry. So vertical integration means that one company owns the entire supply chain from raw materials to manufactured goods. Now, it doesn't have to be in a manufactured goods setting, but so for example, say there is, let's use electricity, right? So say there's a power company, and the power company owns all the wires. They own all the telephone poles or underground wires, if that's what your country uses. They own all of the substations, and they own all of the transformers. They own all the transformers, right? And they own all the power generation stations. And they own the coal mines or the natural gas pipes that create the electricity. So in that situation, the one power company actually owns every step of the chain of getting power to you, the consumer, from the mining of the raw materials to actually creating electricity and getting it to you, right? That's what's called vertical integration, okay? And that's just one example. There are lots of examples out there, but that's just an easy example. And then there is what's called horizontal integration. So horizontal integration is essentially where you use your power to gobble up all of the businesses around you that compete or compete adjacent to you. And essentially, you create what's called a conglomerate. By the way, in the vertical integration, you also create a conglomerate. Conglomerate just means a multi-purpose large corporation. So it's like, a company that manufactures widgets but also sells cars, right? Just as an example. So this conglomerate then essentially gives the company, the horizontally integrated company, such a large market share that they push out other businesses. By the way, this is the Walmart model, effectively, right? So Walmart has essentially outcompeted, bought up, bought out, closed out their competition and become the kind of one-stop shop for whatever it is you might need because they sell so many things. So that's what horizontal integration is. So the government, when they're practicing antitrust policies, they're trying to prevent these two types of integrations and just regular monopolies in general. And the way that they do that is they require certain companies to verify and validate who they can buy and who they can't buy. And they keep a record of what level of the economy, they keep a record of how much market share any given company has and does not allow them to merge with each other. It says that merge is illegal because it would create an anti-competitive space, right? So the reason I wanted to talk to you about this today, one, because it's been on the whiteboard for literally forever, but two, because there's an interesting antitrust case that didn't happen that I think should have. So Amazon purchased MGM Studios, the studio that makes Tom and Jerry with the giant lion. He roars before all the things, the lion with the gold film around him. The lion. MGM Studios, just look it up. So Amazon bought MGM Studios in order to bring more content to their streaming service. MGM is a major motion picture studio that makes lots of content and owns lots of content. And the government of the United States just kind of let that go. And personally, just like when AT&T bought CNN, Time Warner and AT&T merged, I believe the government should have taken more scrutiny on these cases, because what happens is, even if the Amazon MGM deal does not cross whatever artificial threshold may be set that the government is not willing to let pass, you are creating these mega corporations who, by the way, Amazon just shouldn't get any bigger in general. Amazon in general is already a horizontally integrated corporation, and they are starting to look at vertical integrations as well for some of their revenue streams, which is horrifying. We should not allow Amazon to grow any further, but we have, because it looks like the MGM deal is going to go through without any scrutiny. Now, mind you, this can go to court, but it probably won't, because it's just very difficult to bring a case in court about antitrust for a variety of reasons that I don't really want to get into here. But we need to be careful as consumers and encourage our government to work on antitrust and creating more strict antitrust, because although it's a really boring topic with lots of nuances, as I've just spent the last 15 minutes explaining, it's really important. Because if we're going to continue in this capitalist system where profit is above all else, the natural inclination will be to combine. And the more combining that happens, the more likely it is that we as consumers pay higher prices, because there's no one to stop them from charging these crazy high prices to us. So it'll be interesting to see, what happens with the MGM Amazon merger. I think primarily what they're looking for is just to make sure that Amazon Prime Video has more content, and it's not really the end of the world. But truthfully, we should be making sure as consumers and as people who value good governance that we are checking every single merger of large companies, because they are oftentimes the ones who are able to merge the most because they have the most resources, right? You don't have to, in a merger, you don't actually have to agree with someone that they want to merge necessarily. And you can buy people who aren't for sale, unfortunately, right? Not people, but businesses can buy other businesses that are not for sale. So we just have to be careful, and we need stricter antitrust rules. Chuck Schumer was thinking about passing some a while ago, but if you don't explain what antitrust is and you don't talk to the American people in kind of a more nuanced way and don't use legal jargon, hopefully I was able to explain this in a way that you understand. If not, please leave a comment. I'll happily reply. This is actually super important as an issue, but we're not talking about it because it just sounds really boring. And in truth, it is really boring. But if you want to be in a situation where you're not constantly paying incredible prices for random stuff that just shouldn't be so expensive, then we need antitrust, because once we get to a situation where there's only a few companies left, they will charge us whatever they damn please. In fact, and I'll end on this, in fact, the best example of this that I can think of right now, just off the top of my head, is Uber and Lyft. Uber and Lyft are two companies that were venture financed, and they operated at a loss for years and years and years until they outcompeted the taxi companies that were selling vehicle ride services, and they drove them out of business with their low prices. As soon as Lyft and Uber had the market cornered, and there were no other taxi companies to compete with them other than each other, the prices of Ubers and Lyft shot through the roof. And now people pay incredible amounts of money to travel on Uber and Lyft, even short distances. So, I hope I was able to explain antitrust to you. I hope now when you see in the news that corporations are merging, you will think about antitrust, you will think about market share, because as boring as it sounds and as legalistic as it sounds, it's your pocketbook at the end of the day. So I hope I was able to explain it. Please put any questions in the comments. I'd love to answer them. And that's going to be the end of our politics segment for this week.
All right, guys, so we have our bread, and boom, look at that. It actually rose despite being kind of dry. So I'm glad I put as much oil on as I did. So now we're going to take our bread out of our bowl, and once we do that, we are going to give it a quick knead to just incorporate some of that oil that's in there, hopefully add a little bit of moisture to the dough. Now, you don't need to do this, and you don't need to use much oil if you took my advice earlier and just use less flour, especially if you're using hard wheat flour like I'm using here. So I'm just kneading this together, getting it ready. Next, we're going to divide it by weight. Mine was 44 and change ounces. I did a quick cut here, and let's see if I got it to the right weight. 22-ish, more or less. Doesn't really matter. So what we're going to do now is we're going to shape our two loaves. Okay, so the first way we're going to shape our first loaf is we're going to use a rolling pin. I'm using a French-style rolling pin here to essentially create a giant rectangle, okay? And you're just going to work this slowly but surely out into a rectangle. There's no specific specifications that are necessary here. Just kind of roll it out as much of a rectangle as you possibly can, as thin as you can get it. Because what we're going to do afterwards, and what you're going to see in a moment here, once we have rolled this out to a nice large rectangle, is we're going to start rolling this up from one side and pinching the ends as we go. So what you're going to see here is just me rolling this up very carefully, making sure to keep out as much air as possible and just pinching the seams on both sides, okay? And actually, this one turned out much better than the one I'm doing now, which is just shaping it with my hand. So I highly recommend the roll method. If you can use it, it comes out with a much nicer loaf at the end of the day. So I highly recommend that as opposed to free forming it. And I'm glad I tried it. So please use that one. All right, next up, we're going to take our cornmeal. It says 3 tablespoons, but I actually don't think you need that much. Just keep it heavily cornmealed, and then we're going to place our breads on here. Final preparation before we chuck them in the oven. We are taking we are slicing first. We are making cuts in our bread, 4 on each one. I am using a very sharp knife that was gifted to me by my uncle, so thank you, Uncle, for literally making me this knife. Next, we are going to take 1 tablespoon of egg white and 1 tablespoon of cold water, mix those together, and coat every nook and cranny of your bread with these. Okay, you're just seeing me do it on one. Every little bit counts. Get it in as many nooks and crannies as you possibly can, including the scoring you just made. And just repeat that on the other loaf of bread. Now what we're going to do, we're going to put these in a cold oven, okay? A cold oven. Do not preheat your oven. 400 degrees for 35 minutes, okay? This is going to it's an interesting way of doing things, but it does work. It was done exactly on time. It was reading 207 degrees for me. All right, guys, I hope you enjoy. I will see you next time. Bye for now. Thanks for watching this video, guys. If you liked it, throw a like on it, share with your friends, and subscribe for more of our content. You can also find all of our videos and clips on youtube.com. Just search Let Them Eat Bread and you'll find all of our content. All right, guys, see you next time. Bye for now.